Welcome back. Of course, as the nation mourns the passing of the founding president, Dr. Sam Shafishuna Nujoma, of course, we continue to bring you coverage on his life and times, particularly, of course, reflecting on his leadership, the legacy, and the impact that he had on Namibia and beyond. To help us analyze, of course, his continuous conversation, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Kaire Mboende, a seasoned diplomat, former ambassador, and political analyst, who will give us a little bit of insight on Nujoma's approach to foreign policy and international relations. Somebody who has, of course, also covered him for quite some time is Mr. Graham Hopwood from the Institute for Public Policy and Research, the executive director there, as well as a media expert. They'll be joining me online as we reflect, of course, on his legacy, particularly within the political and foreign arena. My name is Ricardo Knabosep, and I'll be with you, of course, right up until this evening with this special broadcast that we'll be bringing to you as well. That is here, live on TV, as well as online on our digital platforms, as well as on the website of the Namibia Broadcasting Corporation. Let's quickly welcome Dr. Mboende and the Graham Hopwood online. Dr. Mboende, can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I can hear you clearly.
Mr. Hopwood, Graham, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Ricardo.
Yeah.
I think let me start with you, Dr. Mboende, just to really just have a brief reflection on your relationship with the founding father. What were some of your first encounters with him on a personal level?
Well, my first encounter with the founding father, let's say apart from the fact that he was known in the community and we heard about him before we even met him. We had very close relations with my father, with the late Jose Aktakwa and others. So we had a lot about that. But my own encounter, his first encounter, was in 1974 at Chatoshwa, and the military training camp. And he came to address the new arrival, so let's say, exiles, a group of us young people who crossed the border into Angola and eventually ended up in Zambia. And he came to address us. I think it was about August 1974, and that was my first encounter. And he was very warm, very motivating and encouraging. And since then, we have been really following his life, and we have been in contact. But so for me, first of all, Sam Nujoma stands out as a freedom fighter. And he encouraged, he kept on the fight and make everybody who were involved in the struggle believe that victory was possible. And so he was resolute. He would run up and down, hardworking. And you cannot just be around a person like that without learning and being inspired by his persona. Because he was, but first of all, he was a nationalist. Namibia must be free, and that is really the first thing that you remember.
Many say, Dr. Mboende, particularly those early years in the 70s and 80s, that he had an unbrittled and unshaken belief in the fact that Namibia was going to attain that independence. It's something that he was such a solid motivating factor for a lot of the fighters that were abroad as well as here in Namibia. What are just your reflections on that stance, and that the conviction that freedom was going to come one way or the other?
Yes, I think the conviction was very important. He believed freedom was going to come, but he also believed that we have to work for it. It doesn't come on a silver platter, and we have to sacrifice for it. So he spent his entire life traveling around the globe, mobilizing resources, and leading the movement. So with Sam Nujoma around you, there was no way you could doubt that freedom was indeed on site. And every year would say that, oh, next year in Windhoek, next year in Windhoek. But it took a long time before we got there. But he was very inspiring and motivating.
Graham, I just want to bring you in at this stage in the conversation as well. Perhaps just a brief reflection from your side on some of your first encounters with the founding president or his work.
Thanks, Ricardo. I mean, I first met Sam Nujoma when I was an anti-apartheid active in the UK. My brief discussions with him then, it was all about that he was crisscrossing the world, basically being campaigning for Namibian independence, speaking to people in government, charity movements, mobilize people on the ground, and to resource for the liberation struggle. And then I think my sort of second phase, to some extent, was being a political writer for the Namibians, when as in full flow really as the president in 1990. We were sent needed a direct character to lead the nation. So much work to do in setting a whole range of institutions, and also I think in key themes for the identity of the nation. And I would say one in the early 90s, national nation. I think he announced, it was never written down, but it was always a work in progress, and it was something that he set at his first government. And in some opposition MPs, ministers, he made sure it was multi-ethnic, multi-racial, and I think what happened in the first few years under his leadership really has helped to establish what Namibia is now well known for around the world, which is peace. When he comes here, remarks how peaceful and tranquil this nation is. He has he is responsible in large measure.
Just to look at it, and I think the focus, of course, of our conversation would really be to look at his foreign relations as well, and that's why I want to bring in Dr. Mbwende back onto this one. Dr. Mbwende, if we can reflect a little bit, just talk to us about our stance on foreign policy before independence, of course, also having heard what Graham was mentioning around the president during that time, crisscrossing really to galvanize international support for the movement during that time, right before independence.
Yes, our foreign policy was really based on our national interest, and that is the liberation of Namibia. We would deal with different kind of organizations, different countries, the socialist countries, the non-aligned movement. Of course, Africa was the backbone of our support. The Organization of African Unity and the UN. So unlike many other liberation movements who allied themselves in international conflicts with the one or another group, or under the leadership of Sam Nujoma, maintained relations with the Soviet Union, with China, and a host of Western countries, especially the Scandinavian countries. And so it was really a policy of non-aligned, a policy that was based on Namibia's national interests, the need to liberate the country. And I think this policy very much continued into the era of independence. But he was successful in mobilizing resources and establishing relations with the most unlikely of organizations based on their stand on the issue of national liberation. So the solidarity movement, of which Graham referred to in Western Europe, was very important, and with very good relations. And obviously the socialist countries.
Look, talking about the socialist countries as well, we know they forged quite close relations with Cuba and the Soviet Union as well. But I mean, I just wanted us to just paint the picture of the leadership within the context of global politics during that time, of global geopolitics. We know the Cold War between the East and the West was really at its height in the 70s and the 80s as well. Just reflect a little bit on his ability to be able to maintain these relations on a non-alignment basis, while, of course, having very, very close ties with Cuba and the Soviet Union, where many people were referring to more as the communist bloc during the time of the Cold War.
Well, he was able to navigate between different interest groups, the Soviet Union and Cuba, and also there was the Sino-Soviet split, which spread some liberation movements, some declaring themselves that they are aligned to the Soviet Union and others declaring themselves that they are aligned to China. But SWAPO has maintained relations with China, with the Soviet Union, with Cuba, and a host of Western European countries. And this was really because of the persona of Sam Nujoma and of course, the people who was working with him. But he was the symbol of the struggle. And, you know, whatever negotiations were taking place, within the movement and between different organizations, we knew that the final say will always come from our commander-in-chief.
Graham, I just want to bring you in here as well. I think particularly looking at it from an international perspective, during the time when you, of course, also an anti-apartheid activist in the UK, we know the Cold War was at its height during the 70s and the 80s. And there was always that within the global geopolitical space that need to group the countries according to their support between the East and the West. Reflect a little bit on how that, you know, the narrative and conversations were shaped, particularly in the Western world, and how the Dr. Nujoma's leadership style had influenced the position we had taken of non-alignment during the struggle.
Well, yeah, I think one word I'd associate with the fact of it, pragmatism. So he wasn't ideological in the sense that he chose nuclear West, or he obviously acknowledged and was grateful to receive the support of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, but also there was a focus on West and indeed other parts of the world, the Southern Hemisphere. Level of support and solidarity in Namibia came from across the world. Unfortunately, you know, in the West, time that I was active in the 80s, Margaret Thatcher was in power in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, and they and their parties were not ostensibly sympathetic to swap cause, but that period, London, so they were operating and they were working with the support of a lot of the people, unions, the Labour Party, the churches, a lot of state actors were really playing an important role, lobbying their governments for changes in position so that we could move more quickly towards independence. So I think SWAPO, led by the founding father, was really very smart in the way that it handled the divisions at the time by making sure it worked on both sides of those divisions and getting maximum. So that's, you know, even the 70s, SWAPO recognized an authentic representative of the Namibian people, which was testament to, and in general, SWAPO's diplomatic skill of support, and the broadening of that support, which beyond what such as you can see is getting at the time. Incredibly broad support.
Well, if one looks at it there as well, I think in terms of this particular support, we know that the United Nations also played quite a significant role there, particularly with Resolution 435. Dr. Bwende, can you please reflect a little bit on the importance of that, the Resolution 435, and of course the role that he had played in shaping that conversation and bringing us to that point?
Well, I think the 435 didn't just fall from the sky. It's work that has been done over many years. Um, First of all, let's start with the Africa, with the OAU, recognizing SWAPO as a sole and authentic representative of the people of Namibia. The Africa Group, the United Nations, was a critical element of support for SWAPO. The non-aligned movement was also very important, and of course the socialist countries, and the build-up of or the confluence of all these inputs from all these players that SWAPO established good relations with were critical in bringing about Resolution 435. Of course, one can talk about the group of the five, the Canada, the US, Germany, UK, and and the role they played. But it was because of the pressure that was put both on South Africa, both domestically within Namibia, on the military front, and it was the whole situation that actually brought about an agreement on 435. It was not a goodwill of some other countries, but it was the product of the struggle of the people of Namibia with the support of the international community and particularly of Africa. That is what brought South Africa to the negotiating table. And also that is what made the Western countries play the role that they play in mediating the negotiation of 435.
But in terms of that as well, one would also mention and look at how, I think one of the stories that really stood out for me was also the kind of relationship that was formed with some of the players, even within the apartheid administration. For example, the foreign minister, the former foreign minister of South Africa before independence, Botha, of course, also singing praises of the former, of the founding father and the Namibian leadership, and just the relationships that they had forged during the time as well. Just reflected a little bit on his ability to speak also across the political aisle and political divide, even with the adversaries of the apartheid government.
Yes, I think for Nujoma and for SWAPO, the most important thing was the interests of the people of Namibia and the independence of Namibia. And you could navigate and establish relations with different organizations, non-governmental organizations, and also flexibility where it was needed. And through that, even his worst enemies gained admiration for him, admired him for his resoluteness, because once Nujoma put his mind into something, he went all the way out. And therefore, he couldn't, he would deal with everybody, but taking the interests of the people of Namibia into account at all time. And through that, he was respected, maybe not loved, but respected by the international community, including his adversaries.
Graham, talking about the role of the international community, of course, I brought up the United Nations, particularly Resolution 435, that really paved the way for the transitional alliance to come in and provide that support that Namibia needed for its independence. Talk to us a little bit about his ability to be, at the one end, leader of this liberation movement, but at the other as well, navigate the complex legal and political landscape on an international platform to be able to galvanize that support and really institutionalize the struggle for Namibia's freedom with that resolution and other international organizations.
Yes, well, I think, he went to leagues. He was seen as the commander of the Liberation Army of Namibia. Went to wear the smart business suit to circles and meeting and so on. So I think he was very touching between those worlds. To remember, though, that he wasn't and that, like Dr. Mbwendi, were also Theo Ben-Guriab and a number of others played a very significant role in Stopper's cause at the time, which was Namibian independence. You know, this was something that he indicated in the movement as well. You know, the figure on these issues. It was a team effort in which he tried to bring in as many people as possible, support from within the party, you know, the movement time, and so out to as many players and stakeholders, not all of them in special kind of political field that might be the obvious, to make sure that an immense amount of good work, even today, and that's all diplomacy in the independence period when all the work. So ongoing work in progress, and we still doing it today. I think late President Gangob's foreign policy to all and an enemy to none way, also slogan founding father when he was very much operating in this field.
One of the things that, and I really just wanted to add value to that as well, of course, you've been the director of the Institute of Public Policy and Research, really has seen the shaping of public policy within the country. But one of the important things is the relationship that we've had with the non-governmental organizations or civil society as sort of the fourth estate. And we know since independence, there's been a very, very, very strong civil society here in the country. But we also know, of course, those relationships started already during the liberation struggle with a lot of the Nordic countries, of course, having civil society organizations here, like you mentioned, the solidarity movements and the others as well. Just reflect a little bit on his relationship with civil society and why it was such an important fourth estate since the independence of this country.
Well, before independence, the civil society played a crucial role inside the country. NANSO, Council of Churches in Namibia, and all the unions that felt the Union of Namibian Workers after it was formed in 1985, absolutely crucial in that final push for independence in the late 80s. So I think as that involvement, and of course the Namib 1985 played a crucial role. So I think he respected civil society, and he knew how in terms of their political influence. I think there weren't tensions. I mean, at one point, Namibian faced a ban, and there were sometimes issues with society. It wasn't easy, for example, for the Council of Churches to 1990, but we're fully an independent body of churches now, and there may be difference of opinion. But generally, I mean, while we can see some controversies in that context, President Nujoma did to follow through on the Constitution, which steer into being, and its values were respected throughout the 50 head of state. So while there may have been differences with the media and civil society, by and large, and broadly speaking, he had a effect on that there were non-state actors that to Namibia beyond the government.
Dr. Mbwendi, I just wanted us to take just a minute to reflect a little bit on his belief in Pan-Africanism and the role that he had played generally in a number of liberation conversations here on the continent. We've seen since his announcement of the passing this morning just a lot of condolences pouring in from different pockets within the continent, really just reflecting on the role and overall belief around Pan-Africanism with the likes of Kikwete, Nyerere and others here on the continent. Just reflect a little bit on his stance on Pan-Africanism and that deep belief around the overall liberation of the continent.
Well, I think Nujoma was a Pan-Africanist person. In fact, Namibia is maybe one of the few countries, if not the only country, that the AU anthem, the national anthem. But that has to do with the fact that the struggle for the independence of Namibia, of Africa, started by Africanists in the diaspora, and some of the African leaders were living and in the UK and some other places. And he has been in touch with all these movements, but close relations developed particularly with the Organization of African Unity, that he was also witness to his finding, and he has been involved in all the activities of the OAU as observer, and also developed close relations with African leaders. So he believed, and in effect, without African solidarity, Namibia couldn't be where it is today in terms of the support for our independence. Of course, we fought from Zambia, Angola. A lot of our people, or including himself, crossed through Botswana. And so there was this mutual assistance from African countries and in supporting our cause. But he himself believed in Pan-Africanism, and not only as a political strategy for the liberation, but also as an economic strategy. He believed that we have got to integrate the African countries, create a large market, and take advantage of our natural resources. He was passionate about major large projects involving a number of African countries. Unfortunately, some of these have not come to fruition, but his passion and belief about the need for that to happen was in a class of its own. He was involved in, of course, you know, the involvement in the DRC.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to reflect on before we close off here. You know, that we also had some campaigns, some military campaigns under his leadership, I think in continuance of these efforts of liberation of the continent. Just talk to us a little bit about
Absolutely. Well, one is the support to the DRC, but also support to peace and stability around the world. Now, there was one thing that shaped Nujoma's stance on those. The issue of territorial integrity is critical. And the violation of anybody's territorial integrity, you would say Sam Nujoma was allergic to that. He wouldn't stand any country invading another country who will go into the defense of the country being invaded. That influences his position, obviously, on the issue of Palestine, right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. That influences his position on the situation in the DRC, the situation in Western Sahara, and all this, because it's the issue of territorial integrity and external intervention. Having been occupied by South Africa, that in a way influences position about any foreign occupation of any country by another country. Nujoma will do everything within his power, including committing resources to fight that such a foreign invasion.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for making time to join us. Graham, thank you so much for talking to us as well this afternoon. I'm pretty sure that we're still going to continue to engage you in the coming days as we continue to celebrate the life and times of this liberation struggle icon. Thank you, gentlemen. Well, that was, of course, Dr. Kaire Mbwende, veteran diplomat as well as political analyst, joining us there online, as well as Graham Hopwood, the executive director of the Institute for Public Policy and Research, really just reflecting on the founding fathers' foreign policy before independence and after independence, and of course how he had maintained those relations as well. We know Like Dr. Mwende had mentioned just a bit earlier on as well, he was a staunch Pan-Africanist that also committed resources, including military campaign and the likes of DRC and so on, for the protection, of course, of that integrity, as well as the protection of the peoples of those countries. I would have been quite interested to see what his position would have been on some of these conflicts that are going on right now, but we will continue to provide that coverage and speak to some of those Pan-Africanists during this week as well, to continue reflecting on his legacy. When we come back after the break, we'll be speaking to veteran journalist Gwen Lister, who had, of course, covered Dr. Nujoma as a liberation struggle fighter, as well as a president immediately after independence. We'll talk about, of course, his role in shaping the civil society in the country, as well as the relationship with the media before and after independence. Stay with us. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, we continue, of course, to celebrate the life and times and the legacy of a liberation struggle, a continental liberation struggle icon, Dr. Sam Shafishuna Nujoma. Earlier this morning, of course, the President of the Republic of Namibia made the announcement of his passing, and since then we've seen all sorts of tributes that have been pouring up, particularly on the social media platforms, of course, from across the world. One particular conversation that also sprung up was his role, his relationship that you've had with civil society, and of course also with the media before and after independence, as it played quite a crucial role in terms of shaping the narratives around the struggle, both here in the country and outside. Gwen Lister is, of course, one of those individuals that had covered the president while he was, of course, also in exile as a liberation struggle icon during the time, and at the same time as well, while he was, of course, the first president of the country. As the founder of the Namibian newspaper in 1985, she provided a platform for fearless journalism, often facing arrest and threats under the apartheid regime. Now, her coverage of Sam Nujoma, both as a liberation leader and as Namibia's first president, offers quite a unique perspective on his leadership before and after independence. And she now joins me in studio so that we can just reflect on that relationship as well. Gwen, thank you so much for making time out to join me.
Thank you, Ricardo.
I think first and foremost, before we get into the details of this, how did the news of his passing reach you? Of course, we know that he's been in hospital for quite some time. The nation has sort of been prepared, for lack of a better word. But what were some of your immediate thoughts and how did you receive the news?
Ricardo, I think, like with everybody else, it was something that was kind of expected. He had been ill for quite some time, and given his age of 95, fragile and vulnerable. And I think even though everybody knew it was a matter of time, I think it still came as quite a shock, because it seems as though somehow the founding father has always been with us. And to suddenly come to the realization that he's no longer here is quite a shock to the system.
What was your first encounter with, because I know, of course, he was in exile for 29 years,
Right.
so many people had come to know of him while he wasn't even around, particularly for those of you that were operating here in the country. So talk to him about the first times that you've heard about him, and then the first time that you actually personally met him.
Well, obviously, I mean, his reputation preceded him. When I was a young journalist who started out working at the Windhoek Advertiser in 1976. And as everybody knows, his depictions, certainly in the Western world, were as this terrorist leader, this communist. You know, so he kind of he was always pictured in his camouflage fatigues and so on. So one had the impression of a larger-than-life, quite scary type of liberation leader. I first met him in 1983 in Paris, and I remember that day very clearly. I was taken along to meet him by a good late friend of mine, Mokanedi Klabanello. And once I was inside, he was there with the late President Hage Geingob, and also the then leader of the OAU Liberation Committee, Brigadier Hashim Mbita. And the three of us sat down and had a long discussion, and I interviewed him, and that was really the first time. And I was intrigued at the time, because most people who know the president, the late president, know that he did not like alcohol. And so as I walked in, he pointed to a tray of drinks and said to me, would I like a drink? And I said to him, no, thank you, but if there's tea available, I'd be very happy to have a cup of tea. And he was absolutely thrilled. A big smile broke across his face, and I think I broke the ice, and I think somehow I got 10 out of 10 from him at that moment.
So that first impression was a pinnacle point in the start of the relationship.
Exactly, exactly. And so from then on, it was a very warm discussion. He'd obviously followed a lot of my journalistic career in the preceding, 7 years, on the Windhoek Advertiser and then later the Windhoek Observer from 1978. And he knew that I covered SWAPO politics inside the country extensively. I was always there at the SWAPO rallies that were violently broken up in many instances by South African security forces. And so my reputation as a journalist who was outspoken in her condemnation of apartheid preceded me. And so it was clear that he felt a kind of trust in me, that he invited me to meet him and later to interview him. So we started off on a very good note.
In terms of that, I think, Gwen, and I think for many of us that got into journalism, there's a certain level of idealism that also follows you when you get into media and journalism in particular. Reflect a little bit on that as well. I mean, you started off with the advertising, like you said, in 76, and then now you're in 83 now, interviewing Sam Nujoma. Between those 2 years, what had happened to have now the start of the Namibian newspaper in 1985 to really say, look, okay, now I've been the journalist, but I think we need now a platform where we can actually continue to drive this message home. Yeah.
Well, of course, my story is not the story of the day, but just to be very brief, I started off on the Windhoek Advertiser, and at the time that the Turnhulle Constitutional Conference was on in 1976, 1977, which culminated in the founding of the Democratic Turnhulle Alliance under Dirk Mudge in 1977, political pressures started to come down on myself and the then editor of the Windhoek Advertiser, Hannes Smith. We were viewed as being too pro-SWAPO because we condemned an internal settlement for Namibia. We wanted an internationally recognized settlement that obviously included SWAPO, and we felt that any settlement that precluded the liberation movement would not work. And so we were very outspoken and critical about that, and so eventually we learned that the DTA, or forces behind the DTA, and slush funds from South Africa were taking over the advertiser. So Smitty and I were asked to either conform editorially, which we both refused to do, and so we left the advertiser. And I remember both of us feeling fairly hopeless. We realized then that there was no media that was outspoken, that was trying to show the human face, if you like, of SWAPO. And so it took a week. And Smitty called me after a couple of days and said, let's start another newspaper. And we started the Windhoek Observer. And the first edition actually came out on Kasinga Day, May 4, 1978. And of course, to cut a long story short, once again, after another 6 years of working at the Observer, during which time I traveled quite frequently abroad to meet with President Nujoma and the SWAPO leadership in exile, the pressure came onto Smitty himself, mainly from the South African appointed Administrator General at the time, that my political reporting on SWAPO was resulting in a lack of advertising, and he threatened boycotts of the Observer. And so really, for economic reasons, Smitty then demoted me as political editor, as I was at the time, and it wasn't long before I left. And it took another year of kind of just freelancing and so on before I decided we should start the Namibian, which was not easy to do at that time. But I realized that then the media landscape was closing in, and that South Africa, if it wasn't directly in control of the media, then a lot of the media in existence at the time was in favor of continued occupation.
And in terms of that, I mean, just talking about the overall role and that the media had also played in terms of just shaping the narratives, particularly in the late 80s around independence. You know, for the layman on the street, journalism, you're required to be balanced in terms of what you're reporting. But the time that we were, I think, of course, we know before independence that we were in a certain political landscape. How was it? How difficult or easy was it for one to be able to balance the narratives while you know for a fact that, look, this is the position that we've taken.
Right. At
the same time as well, within that context of the Cold War, where countries were now being forced to take a side. Are you communist? Are you socialist? Are you with the East? Are you with the West? But just reflect a little bit on the role of the media and that balance that you had to play, and having a leader like Sir Nujoma that was accessible to be able to tell that story. I like that angle of human face that you had mentioned a little bit earlier as well.
It was always a very difficult balance to strike. As a newspaper, especially when we founded the Namibian, we did so for the main reason of promoting independence for Namibia and self-determination. That was our goal in actually starting the newspaper. So we were unequivocally biased, if you like, in favor of independence. Covering both SWAPO on the one hand and the South African security forces on the other was always fraught. Obviously, we covered a lot about the atrocities that were happening under the jackboot of apartheid up in northern Namibia, in particular in those years, and that was difficult. That was the kind of reporting that got us a few bans in the ensuing years, also got us firebombed and, you know, a lot of us jailed and threatened in various ways. So it was not an easy path to follow. At the same time, we wanted to hold SWAPO accountable. So we would, fortunately or unfortunately, I suppose we had a natural bias towards the liberation movement at the time because of what was happening in the country. It was clear for all to see that South Africa's main goal was to silence the voice of SWAPO, whether it was up in the northern regions where the war was raging, or down south where SWAPO tried to hold rallies, where its leadership were continually arrested and detained without trial. So it was kind of difficult to get balance in a time like that. But I think we always aspired to that. We had to be careful when we covered things like atrocities on the part of the Defence Forces. For example, one of our front page photographs, because people had spoken a lot about how the South African forces would parade the bodies of dead SWAPO insurgents on the side of Casper's and sort of patrol through the towns gloating about the death of the insurgents. And the Defence Forces and the police would both deny that it ever happened. And finally, of course, we got a photograph to show it was happening, put it over the front page, really big, and phoned the police. We didn't tell them we had the photograph, but we called them again to say, are you still doing this sort of thing? And they said, no, we never do that. And of course, we called their bluff and the paper was banned immediately the next day. And so it was a constant fight all the time to kind of strike that balance and be there basically for the people of Namibia who were living under this nightmare. And in the north, a dusk to dawn curfew, and where life was incredibly difficult under South African occupation. So it was difficult to be objective about the conditions under which people were living at the time.
But now that objectivity now gets called on at the advent of independence. So in 1990 now we get to our independence. Before 1990, obviously, like you said, there was a natural bias towards, SWAPO and the independence of Namibia, this fight for independence of Namibia. Now comes 1990, and we are expected to follow the letter of the law, to be objective in terms of our dealings, in terms of how we report. Talk to me a little bit about that transition, where many people had also said that Namibia has been a bit of a unicorn in the sense that immediately after independence, we didn't have any attack per se, or jailing, for example, or journalism, or overt action or government really trying to take control of the media in the country. Just when that switch happened, and many have said that it's sort of like a unicorn situation that we've experienced as a country. Talk to me a little bit about that and the role that Nujoma had played as a leader to ensure that once independence has come, the media is still allowed to do their work, and now in turn be able to start criticizing the government that has taken over.
Right. Well, obviously, at independence, Sam Nujoma did preside over the adoption of a constitution that was described as a shining light on the African continent. As most people, or many of the young people perhaps don't know today, but at that time, most of Africa was still under autocratic rule when Namibia gained its independence. South Africa was still in the grip of apartheid. So the scenario, both south of us and further north, was not a very good one. So Namibia came with this constitution, with a Bill of Rights, with freedom of the press, freedom of speech, rule of law, democracy, these sort of things. It was really quite something at the time. And of course, one cannot negate the late president's role in all of this, in bringing about a constitution that really provided for these things. And so for us at the Namibian, it was a time when we had to sit down and reassess. When we started the newspaper in 1985, we didn't really know or think that we would actually make it until independence. I mean, the threats came at us from all sides, but we did. We made it there. And of course, we were donor funded up to independence. And at independence, we were told, well, now that's the time the donor funding will cease. So it was very, very difficult for us not only to find our feet in an independent country, in our peaceful, democratic country, but also to sort of fight for sustainability of the media. We had to survive, or we would die. And so that was a very, very difficult transition. The white business community at the time was obviously still very anti the Namibian. And I think it took a little while before finally we began to get some advertising and so on. So we had to sort of face a fight for survival on several fronts. And then as far as our editorial policy was concerned, the Namibian had always been strongly independent, even though, as I told you, our bias was towards the people of Namibia, but that was translated into a bias towards SWAPO. And so once we became independent, we thought, right, SWAPO is now the government. We need to hold that government to account on its promises and pledges, in as much as we did with the South African government before. And this is where I think a lot of fundamental misunderstandings came into play.
And I know that, of course, you had also had a bit of a brush during his time as president as well. I understand a banning at some stage of government advertising to the Namibian?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I say, I think at independence, everything started out on the right note. The late president was very conciliatory. It was clear he was very deliberate about wanting a parliament or a national assembly that crossed all the ethnic groups of the country. It was clear. He was going to try and push back on that SWAPO is a Novambo movement and they're going to dominate everything. He wanted to bring about a more inclusive society. He came about with a policy of national reconciliation, which of course, with hindsight, we can criticize because it wasn't always adhered to. But the thought behind it was a very nice one, in an attempt to heal the wounds of war and heal the very deep divisions that had come about among the Namibian population as a result of the war. And so we started on a good note, and we were very positive about what was happening. But it wasn't long until, obviously, we had to start keeping SWAPO to account. And I know in the earlier interview, you mentioned, among others, the sort of foray into war in the DRC, which was Nujoma's decision to go and prop up, if you like, late President Laurent Kabila. That was something that was very controversial here in Namibia, and we editorialized against it. We said we had no business in this foreign war. And there were other issues where slowly but surely we kind of butted heads with the late president on a number of issues. It included that. It also included, because of his very close relationship with late President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, the sort of who started attacking gays there, so Nujoma followed suit in Namibia. So editorially speaking, there were a couple of areas where we began to sit and criticize government and what was happening and hold them to that Bill of Rights that we'd been so proud of to have in Namibia. And so, as I say, with hindsight, I saw more of President Nujoma in the liberation years prior to independence than I did post-independence. And kind of because of that, as I say, we'd started out with a very warm relationship. He trusted me implicitly, but he somehow felt that I and or the newspaper had turned against SWAPO, which was not the case. We wanted to say when good things were being done, but we also wanted to speak freely when we felt we were going wrong. And that was, I think, often misconstrued. So I was cast into the political wilderness fairly early on after independence. I was not, and even have not been to date, a very frequent guest at State House. That included President Nujoma, President Pohamba, and President Geingob. I think I can count on the fingers of one hand the times that I've been there. But it was because I was then construed as being anti-government. And of course, just after independence, when I was offered the post of Minister of Information and Broadcasting by SWAPO, and I turned it down, that I think I kind of really put myself in the wilderness after that. And if you're not with us, you're against us, was kind of something like the feeling that abounded. But I must say, going back to President Nujoma, I was very delighted and very thankful. Although in the intervening years when we've not really been on speaking terms, there were times I tried to get to see him. They weren't successful, but when the president was diagnosed and was in hospital with COVID, late President Geingob invited me to go along with him and fellow cabinet members to meet with President Nujoma in hospital at the time. And that same old smile that I saw in 1983 was again on his face when we met in the hospital. So I was very pleased in a way that we kind of had a rapprochement of sorts after decades of kind of working together and then not being on the best of terms.
I think, when just in conclusion, we know, of course, that we have, as a country, collectively maintained quite a good standing when it comes to press freedom since independence. No journalists really had been ostracized to that extent, where they've been jailed and so forth, like we've seen in other countries. What is how do you want him to be remembered within the media space, particularly by a lot of the young journalists that might not be familiar with the kind of work that had to go in, particularly from political leadership, to bring us to the standard of media freedom that we're enjoying here in the country, and the standing that we have built in terms of reputation globally?
Well, I think it's safe to say that commitment to press freedom, it's not always been perfect, as I've outlined to you, even the ban on the Namibian and so on, has really been fairly intact since the moment of our Constitution's adoption. back in 1989. I think SWAPO have held quite true to press freedom. I often wonder how much it had to do with the fact that there was an outspoken voice within Namibia in favor of self-determination and independence back in the day that warmed SWAPO, if you like, to the fact of media freedom. But I think generally speaking, we've kept true to that. It is absolutely true to say that there have been no arbitrary arrests of journalists and certainly no deaths since independence. Things are not perfect. And as you know, the media has its own struggles right now. And I think going forward, it would be great if the government, which made a very strong commitment, also when we adopted the Windhoek Declaration on a free and independent African press in 1991, that commitment was especially held close by President Geingob, who was probably the first president to be outspokenly in favor of press freedom. It's not to say he always liked the media. Politicians very seldom always do. But the fact was he held true to that. And I'm hoping with the new dispensation coming in March that commitment will hold true going forward.
Thank you very much, Gwen, for making time out to join me this afternoon.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Well, veteran journalist, pioneering journalist, whichever word you want to use. Of course, there's no conversation that we can have about the history of media in our country without bringing in Gwen Lister to reflect a little bit on that. Of course, talking to us about her personal relationship with the president before independence and just the shaping of the media under his leadership right after independence. Stay with us as we continue to cover the life and times of this liberation struggle icon. When we come back after the break, President of the IPC, Dr. Bandoleni Itulak, now comes and joins me, and I'm quite excited to reflect a little bit, particularly on the before independence years with him as well. Stay with us as we continue with this coverage. Don't forget, of course, to engage us on our social media platforms. We are not only broadcasting here on TV, but also online. Check out our website, the Namibia Broadcasting Corporation, as well as our social media platforms for constant updates as we celebrate the life and times of our founding father. Stay with us.
Our first step should therefore to start with a review of some constitutional provision in order to address land ownership in the country. For this reason, the Constitution of the Republic of Namibia is to be amended through a referendum. It is only this way that the state can own the entire land in the country, including the agricultural commercial land. Indeed, I strongly believe that land should belong to the state, and no foreigners should be allowed to own commercial land in Namibia. This is what we agreed upon in the first National Land Conference, and that mechanism should be put in place to speed up the expropriation of without compensation of land belonging to the absentee landlord. However, there are those who are suggesting that such commercial farmland owned by foreigners should be expropriated in the public interest, provided that a fair and a just compensation is given for the infrastructural development that has taken place on the farm. Similarly, the first National Land Conference resolved that given the difficulties in redressing ancestral land claims, restitution of such claims in full.
Well, we decided that in the Politburo, the Central Committee of SWAPO, that we face the arrested illegal South African administrators in the country, whatever the face may be. If they continue with the arrest, we had the capable army, the People's Liberation Army Namibia SWAPO's military wing, to effectively counteract them. Therefore, we were ready to take over even by force. The aim and objective of the SWAPO party was to fight and liberate the territory of Namibia, from the Orange River to the Kunene River, from the Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean to the Zambezi River. And we succeeded.
Thank you very much. We still continue, of course, with our coverage of the life and times of the founding father of the Republic of Namibia. This morning, President Dr. Nangolo Mbumba, of course, announcing his passing. We know that he had been ill for quite some time. The nation had been sort of prepared, for lack of a better word, over the last 2 weeks when he had entered hospital and was not in a very, very good condition. But nonetheless, of course, the sad news reaching us early today as well. And we continue to reflect on his life and times. I'm now joined in studio by the president of the Independent Patriots of Change, the IPC, Dr. Banduleni Tula. But before he was the president of the IPC, he was, of course, also part of the SWAPO party as a liberation movement. And I'm particularly interested in reflecting on those times in the 70s and 80s as well. Dr. Tula, thank you so much for making time out to join me
Thank
today.
you very much indeed.
Just before we get into, of course, some of those historical reflections, how did the news of the passing of the founding father reach you, and what was some of your immediate reaction to that news?
This was quite weird. We are both celebrating his life, but at the same time, sadly, mourning his passing. And it's very, very strange that yesterday at 12 noon, I had a meeting in Swakopmund with many of my party leaders. But before I started that meeting, something was telling me a message. And I then asked for us to have a moment of reflection and remembering that he was under these circumstances. And we had a moment. This is very unusual. You don't have a moment of silence when somebody's in hospital. But somehow something has just driven. And 1 o'clock in the morning, I received a call from a senior member of the party of SWAPO to say that, unfortunately, our president has passed on. And that is the time that I got it. And I went into this silence and reflection. And I've got that mourning of myself that I go in and look at everything else. So it's a celebration, but at the same time, it's a sadness as well, especially for his family, his close friends, his close comrades, etc. But it's a legacy that he has left of what he has done for Namibia. Yeah.
If we can take a step back, when was your first, because we know, of course, he was in exile for 29 years.
Yeah.
And for many people that were internally in the country, it was first the story, reputation before you physically meet him for the first time.
Yeah.
When was the first time you've heard about him, and what was your first encounter like when you met him for the first time?
Well, back in 1971, when the worker strike started, I was, of course, born in Windhoek, and I was brought up not very far from where Tatekulu had their house as well in the 50s as well. And when the worker strike in December started...
Which house is that you're referring to now?
In the old location.
In the old location,
yes.
now. All right.
Now, in 1971, now what I'm trying to describe here is the myth of some Nujoma that we've never met as young people as we're growing up, and the influence that he had to give us that energy and engine inside Namibia throughout the 70s, until my first encounter of meeting him in 1981 when I just left prison into exile.
So what was the
this
myth like?
70s, this 70th, you had the myth of the freedom fighters. And there was this myth which says that the freedom fighters were cooked in pots, and you'll understand when it comes to meeting him what it meant then as well. And in the 1970s, all we used to do is go into the location from Benjamin Namalambo's house, singing Sema Ulipe Nielu Le Pandela, Sema Ulipe Nielu Le Pandela, and go to the meetings then as well. And at the same time, we need to understand the crucial timing in 1976. And that is the time that there were troubles in the party, the Shipanga years in exile, etc. And that was also the year that the first SWAPO party constitution was actually crafted and adopted. Before that, there was only the little booklet that Ngarikutike Chiriange has actually, with Amel Apollos, actually put together. That's the only guiding principle until the Tanga Conference of 1969-70 and also 1976 when the first constitution came in. The Tanga Conference created also the wings as well, the SWAPO Youth League, the Women Council, and the elders.
Within
so
the
before
party.
that, in 1973, we belonged to Namibian Black Students Organization, which was led by Vekwi Rukoro, and the Secretary General was, of course, Tapopi, Nashilongo Tapopi, who was also the youngest political prisoner on Robben Island from Namibia, amongst all the political prisoners, including those of South Africa. Now, in 1973, the SWAPO Youth League was then established. And that's when we were moved away from the Namibian Black Students Organization to the SWAPO Youth League. But at that time, the internal structure was not properly formulated. And it was in 1976 that the first Congress of the SWAPO of Namibia was established in Walvis Bay, where all the leadership was then elected. When those leaderships were elected in 1978, after the passing of Resolution 435, SWAPO of Namibia had been given permission by the South African regime to establish an office in Windhoek. Initially, it was in Dongeruk in a roof, and then it moved to somebody's house in Klein Windhoek, and then to the Lutheran Church. In 78, we were then allowed to campaign openly, although we were victimized still, and we established an office where Chongarero and Klabanero and Axel Johannes and Franz Kambangula and Reverend Chirimwe, Reverend Carrera, all the officers were there. And it's quite ironic that Gwen Lister was here, but we were operating at that office and it was broken in after everybody was arrested. And I remember Gwen in February 1979 coming to our office, then working for the Observer with Smithy, to come and take those pictures. And one of the pictures was the picture of Comrade Sam Nujoma, torn to pieces on the ground, of course. So the 70s, we were campaigning internally, mobilizing, motivated by the leadership of Comrade Sam Nujoma at that time.
And is this even while he's in exile?
While he's in exile,
is there?
while we have not seen him at all. And it was just that. And in 1979, we all were arrested and went to prison. And inside prison, when I was arrested, I was initially at the Bahnhof political prisoners, and if you were to meet with Nico Smith, he was one of the people who worked on the other side at that time as a police officer. And I would be singing Sema Ulife and teaching all these people who have been arrested without pass books into the cells as well. And later on transferred to Hobabes, where all the entire leadership was. That leadership was elected in 76, and that is the leadership inside the country that was mobilizing people, the leadership that was taking people out. We used to take people out to Hobabes to go into exile, to go to the north, to go into exile, feeding the liberation struggle. And this is where the struggle inside Namibia under the leadership of both Nathaniel Mahwili, actually Mahwili is just his nickname, Nathaniel Mahwili, was so significant in formulating that. And we should not forget Keshi Nathaniel, of course, the first president of the SWAPO Youth League when it was established in 1973. And I remember on the 12th of August 1973, when we had a meeting at what we call now the ShopRite in Katutura area there, and Comrade Jerry Ekanjo stood up and said that, and it was all under the theme of Sema Olipeni and all the others. We were all inspired, and we've never seen this man, this leader at all, this inspiration of Namibians at all. And it's when he said, rivers of blood will flow for Namibia's independence. And that was the reason why Comrade Jerry Ekanjo was arrested and later on imprisoned in Robben Island, together with Nashilongo Tapopi. Now, fast forward, we were then released from prison and then put under house arrest, and then the church organized for us to go into exile. So I went to London.
So this is now 1981?
1981. So I went into London. And then Comrade Sam Nujoma then came to London in April to a function and a reception there was there. And I remember coming to that reception, and he stood at that reception straight with a serviette and a glass of orange. And he stood still listening to these people speaking. And then we went off to President Hotel in London. And he went, of course, in his room, and we were sitting in the living room. And it's me and late Tate Nangolo Damkwilongo, who was also a political prisoner. And we sat down there with the chief representative of SWAPO. And I was only in London in a few weeks. And the chief representative, Shapwa Kaupungwa, came into the reception area from the bedroom, of course. And he said, yeah, the president wants to see you. I said, I've never seen Nujoma before. And inside Namibia, I thought, all these freedom fighters we used to deal with the typhoons and tsumeb, etc., cooked in pots, etc.
So all this information is running through your head now.
Coming now. And then His Excellency Dr. Safishuna Sam Nujoma came out of his room, and we all stood up. And I looked at this person, and I looked at and said, Shuambo, this one must have been cooked in a bigger pot because it's the president.
Just a larger-than-life presence.
Yes, here is the life president. And then Comrade Shapwa Kaukungwa said, Comrade President, this is your political prisoners. He is the youngest, he is the oldest. And he greeted us there, and the television was on. And then Lord Carrington, who was the foreign minister of the United Kingdom at that time, was on the screen. And Tatekulu said there and said, these people, they are taking out our resources and our wealth. That is the first time I heard him speaking. Our economic wealth is being taken out. And the way he spoke, now I had this struggle between the one speaking and the myth itself. But subsequent to that, we then, when I stayed in the UK, we invited him to Sheffield in 1987 when we hosted the SWAPO flag then. And he came and saw the flag that and said, truly, Namibia will be independent. And that time it was not fashionable to host a liberation movement's flag on a public building, a town council. And the SWAPO flag was the first one to be hosted there.
But particularly with that, looking at the kind of environment it was, particularly with the Cold War and the communist visits, etc., etc. I've got a number of questions still coming up on that, but I want us to go for a short break as we continue. If you just joined us, welcome, of course, to this special broadcast, the ongoing commemoration and celebration of the life and times of the founding father of the Republic of Namibia and a global liberation struggle icon in the name of Dr. Sam Safishuna Nujoma. When we come back after the break, we continue to speak to IPC leader and, of course, a former liberation struggle fighter himself, Dr. Panduleni Itula. Stay with us.
We cannot sit idle while many of our people still bear the burden of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. I can think of no more noble objective to pursue than the realization of the aspirations of our people to be self-reliant and to depend on their native intelligence and labor in order to transform their dreams into reality.
Welcome back. Of course, the passing of the founding father of the Republic of Namibia, that earth-shattering news was delivered by President Nangolo Mbumba early this morning. And we've been seeing, of course, tributes pouring in from across the world, particularly a lot of reflections from African leaders and those that are, of course, former presidents, current presidents, even those that are in the civil society and the media have been pouring out and speaking about his leadership style and his standing on the continent as well as the rest of the world. I'm joined in studio by IPC leader Dr. Panduleni Itula, who was, of course, also as a liberation struggle fighter himself in many respects during the 70s and the 80s, also heading out into exile as well, and we're reflecting a little bit on that time with the late president as well. Dr. Itula, I wanted to just take a step back. I know that there was always a conversation around that we were actually supposed to get our independence in 1978, but there were certain demands that the founding father was quite staunch and steadfast about in terms of how he wants to see this democracy unfold. Reflect a little bit on that pause in 78 and now coming into the 80s where you had to really start shaping things for the independence of Namibia.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't forget that there was Resolution 365 of 1976, one of the other resolutions that describe how Namibia comes to independence as well. And we must remember also there was the contact group, France, German,
the Western contact group.
Yeah, the contact group, the negotiating group from the West, France, German, Canada, United Kingdom, and the United States of America. And that contact group did come about because it was suggested that initially the Western said that, yeah, you people are leaning too much to the East. And said, well, what did you do to assist us? We came to you to say, don't support apartheid regime. And, you know, Peter Kachavi will reflect much, much better on that one as my mentor as well. And that's where I got the picture from. And then in 78, 435 was then passed. And at that time, we were preparing for the campaign for the independence. But there was one tricky situation, and that is the situation of the South African troops in Namibia. Where should they be? They wanted to be somewhere in Grootfontein, and the argument was, hang on a minute, you know, chaps, you are going home. Go all the way home. And there was a little bit in the negotiation, because remember, there was the armed struggle, there was the diplomatic struggle, there was the mobilization struggle inside Namibia that we were engaged in, and we were fed information as to what we need to prepare in order to prepare for the independence. And we had to mobilize inside the country itself to prepare for the independence process that was going to take place. But of course, that was halted until much later. And in 1978 as well, you will recall that there was a formulation of the type of skeleton of the constitution that was going to be adopted in Namibia, proposed by the contact group, by the 5 contact group that was then coming from the Security Council and to the Secretary General, and for them to say that this should be some of the principles that must be reflected in the Namibian constitution.
What do you make of this? Because I like the way you put it, where you say, look, there were a number of the struggle was on a number of fronts.
Yes.
You know, diplomatic on one end, mobilization here on the ground, so military action there as well. But particularly during the time now in exile, meeting him in London, reflect a little bit on his leadership style in as far as mobilizing international support is concerned, and how it also engaged with some of the non-governmental organizations or non-state actors.
Yeah,
there.
I think it would be unfair to, because I haven't actually encountered him a lot of times. But for him to actually take time and to say, I've heard that the SWAPO party flag was hosted by the anti-apartheid movement with the Namibian Support Committee inside the United Kingdom, and he made an effort to come and address the people in Sheffield in the town hall. Now, within the United Kingdom, from 1981 when I went down there, every time that there is a meeting, you'll find that Comrade Sharper at the head office or Comrade Jacob Hanai will send out a message to say, could you go and address these people? Can you go and address these minors, etc.? So we used to go out in the morning to our educational institutions, and in the afternoon you've got the political bag and you go around, and trains and buses, etc., to speak to the populace as well. And sometimes when there are events like the Nottingham Carnival as well, we would join them, but promoting the independence of the Republic of Namibia as SWAPO members and SWAPO students at that time as well, especially with Comrade Beans Kavanas, Abraham Yambo, loads of other people, Zoom Bakwe and all the others, including our Judge President Damasep as well, and also Honorable Utoni Nujoma, who later on came to Warwick University to study law as well. So the students in the UK were not only studying, they were actually campaigning and mobilizing and also supporting each other and supporting the liberation struggle. And there was also the campaign for medical aid for refugee settlements in Angola and in Zambia as well, that a lot of the students were engaged as well. And every time that you go to address people, they will offer money, they will give checks addressed to SWAPO, of course. So we had to do that as well. But the significant thing is this, that there was a leader who was not in Namibia, but was crisscrossing all over the whole world to try and prompt up support. And at the same time, that support was on all 3 fronts: education for Namibians, military support, diplomatic support. And you need to look at the leaders that we have in Namibia as well, and those that passed on, such as our late President, Dr. Hage Gottfried Kenkop. He mentored so many of them. And I always say that when His Excellency came from exile to start the government, he was spoiled with talent. He was spoiled with capacity. He had everyone else to pick. There was a government already sitting, ready. Although there was never a government in exile, there was a government ready, sitting to come and take over. So, but his role was more inspirational. We stood at Covent Garden singing, Nujoma, to Kwatela Commission, all these songs that we have sung in the liberation struggle then. So it was only after independence, when I started now planning to come back, that I first went to his farm at Tetunda in 2008. That was the very first encounter. And I came there and he said, what time is he going to come? And I said, I'll come at 10 o'clock. And he prepared everybody else and said, yeah, this comrade from London, he will be here on time, watch out. And then Asino met me at the kraal of the cattle to take him to him. And we spent 3 hours talking with him, the two of us. There's a picture of me with him just sitting on the couch, talking and talking. And I remember asking him, Comrade President, why did you decide to step down as president of the party? He said, well, some of us are designed for certain times, and when those times comes in, we have, of course, to move on and give other comrades to take over. And then in 2008, I was still in the United Kingdom, and he asked me the question and said, are you armed? I said, what do you mean, Comrade President? He said, do you understand law? I said, no, I'm a maxillofacial surgeon, I operate on the jaws, etc. And said, no, you need, if you've got an opportunity, to go and study a bit of law. We liberated the country, a few compromises, but these people are squeezing us with the legal bits here. So that's when I went to go and study law as well.
As we're closing off the chat, I think I will be doing it injustice if I don't ask this question. But we know, of course, it was that conversion from being a commander of a liberation movement, and now the advent of independence and switching now your leadership from being a military commander now to coming in and becoming a president that must uphold these democratic ideals, following of the rule of law, not ostracizing political opponents, etc. Just speak to me about his legacy that he leaves behind in the country around political tolerance and freedom for one to practice different political ideologies within this country without really being ostracized. If you look at it since independence, nobody has been jailed or locked up for having a completely different view or extrajudicial political killings taking place here in the country. Just in conclusion, if you can reflect on that.
We need to understand that Comrade Sam Nujoma was a custodian of our Namibian constitution that provided us that very democratic principles that we believe in. And one thing that really struck me, given the history of political parties being formed, is the fact that when I stood as an independent presidential candidate, I did not see the famous pointing finger of Tatekulu condemning me or condemning anything. He did not voice anything about Dr. Itula as an independent presidential candidate. But when you go back to the other COD, RDP, there was quite a time that he was pointing fingers to them. But for some reasons here, he embraced the democratic principles and allowed us to freely exercise our political activities, irrespective of which political party. The formation of IPC was demonstrative there too as well. After IPC was formed, we have not had a single voice from His departed Excellency against the will of the Namibian people wherever they are to exercise their political activities. And we need to underscore that he embraced us all as a father figure, and he went into retirement and allowed everyone else to flourish in this environment of political freedom. When you go to other countries, we did not have that. And that is one thing that we as Namibians constantly united under that principle of our departed leader, we must remember. Every time that we feel that we are falling by the way, think about that embracing big hand of the founding father that keeps us together. And we need to remember to continue to do so and maintain the peace that he fought so hard. He sacrificed not only His own youth, he left at the age of 33. He sacrificed his own marriage, leaving children, young children, in old location when he left this country. He sacrificed his own education, rather prompting other people up to go and study. He could have decided, let me be selfish and go and study. He was a selfless leader, a negotiator, a patient leader, consistent leader who persevered over the many years of being in exile until independence. So we've got a gem of a leader that we must really keep really to our hearts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Itula,
Thank you very
for
much.
making time out to just come and talk to us and reflect a little bit. It's not always, it's not very often that we hear about some of the inner workings, particularly before independence, when it comes to the party and our different leaders as well. So thank you for making time out to be with us
Thank you
today.
very much indeed.
That's the president of the Independent Patriot for Change, Dr. Panduleni Itula, of course, reiterating the importance of maintaining the kind of political freedom that we have in the country, and of course also the fact that the founding father was really a uniting figure and stepped down and allowed Namibia to thrive and the different political players and the climate within the country. There was that one banner of one Namibia, one nation, and I think that's what he was alluding to in his closing of course, responses to some of my questions this afternoon. We continue with our special broadcast from Studio 2 here in the Northern Industry at the Namibia Broadcasting Corporation's headquarters as we bring you the life and times of our late founding father. Join us, of course, in some of that commemorations. Your comments and questions are welcome on our social media platforms. On our social media, that's, of course, on Facebook, Twitter, as well as Instagram. Follow NBC Digital News, and you can get up-to-date details on the latest around the arrangements of the passing of the founding father of the Republic of Namibia. Ricardo Tlagosep will be back after this short visit to the marketplace as we continue to provide you with this coverage.
We cannot sit idle while many of our people still bear the burden of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. I can think of no more noble objective to pursue than the realization of the aspirations of our people to be self-reliant and to depend on their native intelligence and labor in order to transform their dreams into reality.